Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Good afternoon. My name is Frank Martinez, and it's a pleasure to have Namho Park visit MSR today to share his thoughts on not only data visualization, but some mobile thoughts around data and storytelling. We met at InfoCamp Seattle this year, which was a great conference. And it was an opportunity to see Namho's thoughts, but also to engage on what he's been thinking about and work he's been doing. And it sounds like he's been flying around a lot lately, worked with the Gates Foundation recently, and I think he was just returning from D.C. So I'll turn it over to Namho.
Thank you. I was actually expecting a room full of people. Right, exactly. So today I'm going to give the presentation. Should I be looking this way or this way? That's kind of weird. But I'm going to give a presentation about how to tell your story through data. But I'm going to try to weave two presentations into the space of one time slot, actually. The presentation about visualizing and telling your story through data is, interesting. But it's maybe a lot of the stories that you've already heard. So I'm going to try to go through that really quickly and get to some of the stuff that I've been thinking about lately. And that second part is more about storytelling through mobile environments, through mobile devices, and how that's evolved and my thinking around that. So hopefully we can get through those two presentations within the hour allotted to me. So let's jump into the first presentation. Just a quick intro about the organization that I work for. I work for Forum One Communications, which is an organization that's been around for maybe 15 years. We've done about we've worked with about 500 organizations on about 1,500 projects, mostly in the nonprofit space. So we do web strategy and digital communication strategy for predominantly nonprofit organizations and issue-based organizations. The Gates Foundation is one of our clients. Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. We've worked with the UN, the World Bank, and the IMF, as well as a whole, collection of smaller organizations who work on very important issues. So my role right now is I am the regional director of the Seattle practice and also the West Coast practice, but I'm also the director of mobile services at Forum One Communications. So, a little introduction about me, actually. So, so I was born in Seoul in 1969. So that's where Seoul is. When I was born, in 1962, the GDP of the per capita GDP of Korea was $62, which is kind of amazing. And when we had the Olympics in 1988, it was just under $4,000, I think. And now Korea has a really booming economy, as you know. Samsung, LG, Hyundai, Kia, they're all Korean brands. And it's just over $20,000. So I've seen everything. When I was growing up, I used to play with dirt. But now, you have cell phones, kids playing with cell phones these days. So in the span of one generation, I've seen, incredible change. So this is where I was born. And in 1970, because of my father's job, we went to Rabat, which is in Morocco. In 1971, we went to London. In 1974, we went back to Seoul, went back to London, went back to Seoul, went back to London, went back to Seoul. And then, for grad school, I finally went to New York. It was the first time actually living in the States. And then, just before 9/11, we moved to Washington, D.C., where I got married, and a lot of changes happened in my life, and that's where I started with Forum One Communications. In 2007, I returned to Korea, to give my kids an opportunity to, experience the Korean culture, and also had some opportunities in Korea that I wanted to pursue. And then in 2008, I worked on a project in Hanoi, designing the 2030 plan for urban plan for Hanoi. That was an incredible experience. And then in 2009, I went back to Seoul. And then in 2011, I ended up in Seattle. I started again, at Forum on Communications, returned to my old job, and now I'm in Seattle. Right? So this is a one way to represent my life through data. I mean, this is data visualization, right? Another way to represent my life, I guess, is 18.5 years in Seoul, 0.5 years in Hanoi, 9 years in London, 1 year in Rabat that I have no recollection of, and 7 years in New York, 6 years in Washington, D.C., and 3 months and going on in Seattle. So, I mean, that's another way to represent my life. Okay, here's one more way. So, I studied architecture, and I went to college, and I went to grad school in architecture and practiced architecture for about 2 years. So that's, including all that experience, that'll be 9 years of architecture. I worked in user experience and designing systems for about 7 years. I've worked in web strategy for about 5 years, and I've taught computer-aided design and other kind of teaching engagements for about 3 years, web development for 2 years, urban design for 1 year, and then I worked for a nonprofit, a foundation, for 1 year. So that's another way to represent it. And if you kind of break it out, these are all the kind of virtual environments that I've worked in, and these are actual physical environments that I've worked in.
Do you mean the overlaps?
No, they don't actually mean anything. And as you can see, the numbers don't really add up to my age either. So these are just, there are some overlaps, like user experience and, web strategy. There's some overlaps there, but I just wanted to show you that I've been moving back and forth physically, between different countries, but I've also been moving back and forth between the virtual worlds and the physical worlds, and I constantly kind of meditate around, what's virtual and what's physical. So in this part of the talk, I want to give a couple of examples. 6 ways to tell your story through data. I mean, data is everywhere around us, and through the internet, I think we are experiencing a whole flood of data that we really have to find ways of kind of finding stories and finding deeper ways to engage data. So I'm going to talk about 6 ways we can tell our stories with data, 3 simple ways that we can get started, and hopefully we'll have some time for some discussion at the end. So let's jump right in. So the first technique, I guess, is, speak with numbers. This is Charity Water. This is a capture from maybe a year ago. But basically, Charity Water is an organization that sells really expensive water. And all the proceeds actually go to helping people in developing countries have access to clean water. But basically, that's the gist. But how can they explain the immediacy of this issue through numbers? Right? 1 billion people, right? Almost 1 billion people on the planet don't have access to clean water. I mean, that's just, that figure alone is kind of mind-boggling. But in terms of what they've been doing, it's like 2,524 projects funded so far, and about 1 million people get clean water through these projects. Also, 100%, this is really important for them, 100% of the public donations go directly to water projects. I think that's one of the missions, clear mission that they had, and that is communicated very clearly through numbers. And, just $20 can give one person clean water for 20 years. So, I mean, it's not something that's out of your reach, and they communicate that very clearly through the numbers that they have selected to express themselves. This is the One campaign. Once again, one of the things that they focus on is maternal and child health. And instead of, writing these long kind of, text descriptions about what they do, they can actually jump you over to quick facts. 8.1 million is the number of children under the age of 5 who die each year. So that once again is a very hard-hitting number. About 300,000 mothers die each year due to pregnancy-related causes. And 80% of maternal deaths could be prevented if women had access to basic maternal and health services. So just these 3 figures alone tell you the message. And that is, you don't have to have big data sets. You don't have to have like complex graphs. Just talking with numbers is really clear, it sends a real clear message. You can also tell your story by revealing the change within the numbers, right? This is something that I think, this is Visit Mix. I think this is clearly affiliated to Microsoft. But, I mean, this is an amazing site talking about obesity in the US. The data goes back to 1987, and these white shirts are the states that don't have any data. So these aren't really thin states. I mean, these are states that don't have data collected at that time. But basically what you can see here is that the state with the highest level of obesity is North Dakota at 11.2%, right? Just keep that in mind, 11.2%. Let's zoom ahead to 2007, and this is what it looks like, right? Everybody's collecting data, and 32.6% is the highest level of obesity of any state. And if you take a look at the lowest level of obesity, Colorado, 19.3%, which is still higher than the highest level of obesity in any state in 1987. So just by revealing change, and you can animate this change actually if you use the slider, but just by revealing change, this tells a very powerful story that you really can't, which is really hard to tell through any other means. You need to focus on the story. You need to find the story, and you really need to focus on the story. Here's Clay Shirky, I'm sure you know pretty well, wrote this book recently called The Cognitive Surplus. And it talks about the fact that with the internet and with the availability of tools that you can actually create things with, he's basically saying that before the internet, the main kind of casual activity was television viewing. And that was really, a lot of people were just spending lots of time in front of the TV. But now with the internet, you have an alternative to television where you can actually start creating things. And so this is a really interesting graphic. 2 billion hours a year spent watching TV by US adults, right? And 100 million hours is what you need to create Wikipedia, right? So, I mean, this is a pretty amazing story. Not even 1 year of, all the people watching TV, but, a small fraction of the time expended watching TV. If you actually provide an alternative to TV where you can actually create stuff, this is what happens. And just this graphic alone reveals that story very effectively. This is a client that we've worked with, and they created this 56-page report, I think, around Appalachian states, around the educational system in Appalachian states, and how they were faced with a lot of challenges, poverty, high dropout rate, and other things that really was affecting the outcome of the educational system. You can read the 56-page report. You can take a look at all the data sets. You can download them, and you can look at them. But what is the conclusion here of this 56-page report? Of course, you can read these bullet points, right? But reading the bullet points it's not something that is really easy to do. And also at the bottom it says, to accomplish the above, we have compiled a comprehensive data set from various sources of existent data and conducted preliminary descriptive analysis using selected variables. Results of that descriptive analysis are presented in this report. Just tell me what it's about. So what is the tweetable version of this report, right? What is the 140 character conclusion to this report? And we worked with the researchers, and they hate doing this. They don't want to boil down years of research into something that is so short, because they want the whole breadth of that report to be absorbed as a whole. But of course, nobody has that time. Nobody has that attention span to be able to go through and pour through every single thing, every single word in that report. So, ultimately, tweeting something has a greater impact sometimes than actually having a few people actually read the report. Having a lot of people see the tweet may be more effective than having a couple of people read the report. So we actually forced them to create a tweetable version, and this is what they came out with. Despite financial and demographic challenges, some school districts are actually succeeding, right? So how do you represent this? How do you take the data? How do you represent this in a visual way? So we work with them in this, creating this visualization. So you can set up some challenges on this side, and you can actually see what the results of those challenges are. So the challenge here is, the graduate. You want to set up a challenge which says the graduation rate is greater than 90%. You want to find schools that have that kind of graduation rate. District budget per student is less than $8,000. And percentage of students eligible for free lunch is greater than 40%. So these are pretty tough challenges. But still, you see these pockets of schools which are actually rising above those challenges. So this actually tells that story in a very visual way. You need to also provide context in order to tell your story through data. This is kind of an interesting graph. This is the billion-dollar gram. So everything is in billion-dollar increments, right? So it's kind of interesting. When you actually compare things that aren't in the same space. So for example, if you talk about defense spending, it's always talked about in the context of defense spending. It's so much more percent, more than last year. But that doesn't really give you a bigger picture on things. So when you start comparing things that are outside the context of whatever you're talking about, it actually presents somewhat interesting findings. So for example, $465 billion is what is needed to feed and educate every child on Earth for 5 years, right? That's pretty amazing. And if you take a look at this, $200 million is the entire debt of African nations to the Western nations, right? And then you take a look at something like that, Iraq war estimated total is $300 billion. And the worst case scenario, total cost of the financial crisis to the US government is this amazingly large figure. Saving the Amazon is relatively cheap when it compares to those kind of figures. And even Walmart's revenues for a year, $352 billion is, so once you take a look at these things in different contexts, you start to realize the magnitude of some of these issues. What do you think this is? Guesses? You know what this is, right? You've seen the presentation.
I actually forgot it. I'm looking at it thinking, okay, what is that?
Right. So what is this? What do you think? Have a guess. So it's really hard to tell if you don't have any context, right? It's just numbers. But if you do something like this, it actually immediately you start recognizing what these numbers are about. So average rainfall in certain cities in the US, San Francisco, Seattle, Chicago, New York, and Miami. If you do something like this, it's easier to read the numbers, right? You realize that the darker the color, the more rainfall you're getting, right? If you do something like this, forget the numbers, right? Numbers don't really matter that much, right? When you talk about inches of rain, you have a vague sense of how much rain you're getting. But if you do something like this, you realize in Seattle in January, February, and March, it's very rainy, as you already know. I'm about to find out. But because I arrived in August, which was very dry and which was really, really nice, and it's still very nice. But apparently, it's very rainy in the winter in Seattle. But I can see that. I can see that through this graphic, right? And you can compare, January in different cities immediately. You don't have to actually read the numbers. You can actually take a look at the graphic and see the story right there. You can go a step further and actually locate it on a map. So if you're living in New York and you want to travel to Seattle in January, you can just do the slider and you realize it's going to be very rainy in January in Seattle. This is the scary part for a lot of researchers. Researchers want to tell the stories themselves, but sometimes it's actually better to lose control and let the users explore, discover, and control the data. But one thing that you can do is limit the level of control so that you see that clear message. If you give them full control over the full data set, of course they're not going to find the story. But if you give them limited control within certain parameters, you can really allow them to explore and find the stories themselves. So this is so who lives here and who can afford to live here? This is a map of New York, and it talks about the income levels of people who live in certain areas. So right after I graduated, I moved to East Williamsburg, which is about right there, and it's very industrial, and it's full of artists. But basically, Brooklyn, if you take a look, right after I graduated, I wasn't making that much money. I was working in school. You know, extremely low income, which is 20K, very low income, which is up to 40K, low income, which is up to 60K, and moderate income, and middle income, and then very high income. Basically, I was right in this area, low income, right? And obviously, Brooklyn is a place for a person like me at that time. If you take a look at Manhattan, where I went to school, you know, Upper West Side, look, I mean, students can't live here, right? Look, I mean, students have an extremely low income, right? But it's basically people who have, you know, moderate to middle to, you know, high income that live in that area. So obviously that's very kind of prohibitive of anybody with income levels below that. But as you can see, the graphic actually represents that very clearly and very well. So what's really important here is that once you start to get the interest going, you can actually point people to the actual data, and that will give them context in terms of understanding that data. So you give them a primer, and then you provide them with the data. Find out more right there. So this is a project that GE initiated a couple of years ago, you know, getting some artists and web developers to really visualize their data. And this one actually gives the user some level of control, where you can actually take a look at all these appliances that you find in your house, and you can see how much does each appliance cost to use in dollars. You can also manipulate it so that you can see it in watts, the year, and also the state that you're living in. So it gives them some limited control. This is the one that uses the least amount of electricity, electric can opener. I don't have one. I don't know anybody who has one these days. Who opens cans these days, right? I can't remember the last time I opened a can. Apparently, it's the one that uses the least amount of electricity. The one that uses the most amount of electricity is air conditioning, right? So let's look somewhere in between. You know, a toaster. In Virginia, for a year, you're spending $3.70 in electricity for a toaster. Let's compare that to Washington, $3.03. So it's actually cheaper to run a toaster in Washington than it is in Virginia, which is good. But you can manipulate the data in various ways to take a look at that. So you're providing the user control to find their own stories, but within a very limited scope. And the next step in doing that is, you know, once they start, you know, controlling the data, they can actually tell the stories and tell it to other people about the story that you could probably tell, but also you probably didn't have the resources or the manpower or the hours to be able to tell and find the story. So this is the World Bank, which we've worked with. So they've done a really amazing job in, you know, releasing their data. So has the UN, so has the US government, releasing their data, and actually not just releasing it, but visualizing it in very new ways. So these previously they had this tool where you can just go and, you know, manipulate certain parameters. If you're a researcher or if you were like an expert, of course you know exactly what you're looking for. But if you're like me, you and me, you know, who wants to, you know, check out what the story is, obviously that's not going to provide you with much information. But within given parameters, you can actually see the story happening because they're giving you some tools to be able to see and manipulate that data in very visually compelling ways. So this is Bob Zellick, and he, in order to promote the use of data, he actually created a competition. The World Bank created a competition called Global Apps for Development Competition. Let's read what he says about that. As part of our Open Data Initiative, we will soon announce an Apps for Development competition, challenging the developer community to create tools, applications, and mashups, making it easier for users of development data to make better decisions and better policies to overcome poverty. Bob Zellick, right? What's the interesting word here? I mean, who would have thought that the head of the World Bank would use the word mashup, right? That seems to be completely out of his vocabulary, right? So, but that's how far we've come. APIs and other things, the level of, you know, the tools that we have actually allow that to easily happen. And what he's saying is that we're going to relinquish control of the data so you can use the tools that are available to you and actually create better tools for us. So for the fraction of the cost it will take for their developers to brainstorm and create scenarios and develop these applications, you can have like 10 or 20 or 100 applications for a fraction of the cost by releasing the data and allowing other people, other interested people, to find uses for that data. So this is a competition that we've entered. It was a couple of years ago by Sunlight Labs, designed for America, where they took public health information and did the same thing. And this is what we came up with. County sin rankings. So we basically took this data and mapped it to, the 7 deadly sins, right? So high school dropout rate, income inequality, unemployment rate. These we kind of mapped in a kind of fun way to certain data points. The greener things are, the better the better the situation. The more red, the worse the situation. What you can do now is, take a look at where your sister lives or where your friend lives and start comparing the county that they live with where you live. You can select the county and then you can start comparing things, right? Which is a very unique and easy way to actually take a look at these very kind of heavy data points. So, of course, I mean, if you have really good communication skills and you're a superstar, you can of course, instead of allowing people to tell your story, you can tell the story yourself, right? And that's the case of Mr. Hans Rosling. He's I mean, I'm sure some of you have seen his TED presentations, but I mean, he takes data and makes an incredible story out of the data. He's also created his own tools that a company with that begins with a G, bought and actually incorporated into their G docs, right? So let's quickly run through like a 2-minute presentation by this guy and the tool that he uses. So basically, this is public health data, and he's found data all the way back to 1820, and he's going to explain how public infant mortality and income have a relationship to each other.
Per person per year, and they lost 1/5 of their kids before the first birthday. So this is what happens in the world. If we play the entire world, how they got slowly richer and richer, and they add statistics. Isn't it beautiful when they get statistics? You see the importance of that. And here, children don't live longer. The last century, 1870, was bad for the kids in Europe because most of the statistics is Europe. It was only by the turn of the century that more than 90% of the children survived the first year. This is India coming up with the first data from India, and this is the United States moving away here, earning more money, and we will soon see China coming up in the very far end corner here, and it moves up with Mao Zedong getting health, not getting so rich. There he died, then Deng Xiaoping brings money, it moves this way over here, and the bubbles keeps moving up there, and this is what the world looks like today. Let us have a look at the United States. We have a function here. I can tell the world, stay where you are. And I take the United States. We still want to see the background. I put them up like this, and now we go backwards. And we can see that the United States go to the right of the mainstream. They are on the money side all the time. And down in 1915, the United States was a neighbor of India, present contemporary India. That means the United States was richer, but lost more kids than India is doing today, proportionally. And look here, comparing to the Philippines of today. The Philippines of today has almost the same economy as United States during the First World War. But we have to bring United States forwards quite a while to find the same health of the United States as we have in the Philippines. About 1957 here, the health of the United States is the same as the Philippines. And this is the drama of this world, which many call globalized, is that Asia, Arabic countries, Latin America are much more ahead in being healthy, educated, having human resources than they are economically.
I mean, if you take a look at Hans Rosling, he's an amazing storyteller. He tells the story through data, which could be, incredibly boring and incredibly academic. And he plots it in a way, and he tells the story in a way that is it's actually a story. It's actually a story of health health improvements, and how, you know, with the same level of income, you actually have vastly different stories in this world today. So this is the tool that he used, and it's publicly available. So, I mean, 3 simple ways to get started. You know, you really have to, this is, you know, more oriented to people, you know, non-profits and organizations who want to do something with their data, of course. You know, research, communications, program and development, you know, all these folks need to be inspired. And there are a couple of really good blogs that constantly kind of highlight really good data visualization and the use of, you know, telling your compelling story through the data visualization in very updated daily with really inspirational stuff. But what's as important as that, I mean, after you get inspired, you really need to find the story that you want to tell. And you have to really focus on that story. You can't tell all the story, and you can't give everybody everything. You really have to focus on what is the unique story that you really want to tell through your data. And I mean, for example, this is a very kind of clear and very focused story, and you have to find the story that you really want to tell and focus on it. You need to pull the players together. Storyteller, visual designer, and an engineer was classically how, you know, what the team looked like in terms of, you know, visualizing your data and telling a compelling story through data. But now there are all these tools available that you don't really actually need all those 3 people. You can actually, if you have the inclination and if you have the time and the desire, you can actually use these tools to actually tell the story through your data in very compelling ways. So that's the first part of the presentation. So, wow, 30 minutes. So I have another 30 minutes to go through the second part, which is the more, you know, which I'm a little more passionate about, which is a little less cooked, but it tells a little more about, you know, where things are going for the future. So, any questions about this part of the presentation? Okay, I'll just roll ahead. Okay, so storytelling on mobile. So mobile technologies is obviously something that is catching a lot of people's attention these days. And if you just take a look at the statistics, you know, almost half of the U.S. adult population will have smartphones by the year, roughly about next year, actually. So mobile technologies is fast growing, not just in the U.S., not just in developed countries, but also in developing countries. And, you know, so what are some of the things, what are some of the ways that we can tell our story through mobile? Are the 2 things, storytelling and mobile are the 2 things that kind of came together in this presentation. So my story, I think I've already told my story, so I'm just going to skip over that. But basically, you know, how do we tell our stories these days, today, through our mobile technologies, right? Previously, this is Egyptian Scribe. If you were the king, if you were the pharaoh, of course, you would have this guy following you around all the time and writing down everything that you're saying and recording your actions all the time, right? You know, how many people have enough money to have a personal biographer, right? Not too many people. So you have something like this. You have a phone, and if you hang it around your neck, you can, you know, I think not quite now. I mean, the iPhone that you can get these days, the cheapest one is 16 gigabytes. You know, the biggest one with the biggest capacity is 64 gigabytes. But, you know, every 16 or 18 months, it's doubling for the same price. So you can kind of extrapolate and say that within the next 3 years, you'll have a device that would have 256 gigabytes of memory on a palm-sized kind of device, a mobile device. What that means is, in low resolution, you can capture every single second of your life by just hanging this lanyard around your neck. Of course, you know, the batteries will run out pretty soon, but still, you have the potential of capturing every single part of your life through a device that's hanging around your neck. So, I mean, you don't need that Scribe. Yes?
I don't mean to interrupt. Just a comment that
Sure.
there's a TED.com talk.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So, I mean, I'm kind of referring to that. But, I mean, that's where technology is going. there's other ways of engaging, not just that way, but other ways of engaging, telling your story through mobile. This is a project that NPR has running for a couple of years. They've recently revived it. It's called StoryCore, where you have these booths in certain areas around the states. Grand Central Station in New York has a booth. You go in with your friends, your family, and other people, and basically you tell your story, a short story about your life, and that gets archived for forever, right? And they've created a mobile application where you can actually do that. You can record the story yourself and upload it. So, I mean, that's one kind of literal way of telling your story, and that's a really easy way to do that. Other ways are more automatic. That was, you actually have to have a deliberate, you have to be deliberate. You have to bring your friend or your family member and actually think about what you're going to say and then record it. However, I mean, Nike Plus, for example, tells the story of your run, right? Lots of pain. These were good parts, right? Flat parts, right? It tells the story. It tells the story of your run automatically. You don't need to do anything. All you have to do is, attach this little device to your shoe and run, and it tells the story, right? There's other ways of telling a story, of course. All the photographs that I've taken automatically, now with geodata, geotagging, automatically record where I've been going. Of course, these dots are pretty big here, but if you zoom in, it actually looks at the neighborhood level about where I've gone to. And, Foursquare, of course, you can check into various places. And that actually tells the story of where I've been, which is kind of interesting. And you can have, other tools. This is a very simple tool that my kids play with all the time. It's, stop motion recorder. And, they can actually put together little stories about themselves through stop motion animation. And, this is something that you actually needed a lot of equipment and you needed a lot of discipline previously. But with an iPhone or, any other kind of smartphone these days, which has this application, you can just have a little stand and, you can create a short animation. And I'll share with you some really bad animation. So, right? Nothing really. Here's another one. But you see what's happening? It's nothing, but you're already putting a story into it, right? Here's an alligator, or here's a little penguin that meets and goes, and talks, becomes friends, and, and he invites them over to his house, right, which is moving. People have an automatic ability to take a look at, situations and automatically frame a story out of it. So I thought that was pretty interesting. This guy takes it to a real extreme. His name is Nicholas Felton, and he really takes it to a real extreme in terms of recording the data around his life. And he creates annual reports. Ever since 2005, he created annual reports, all the data points that he's carried, what he's eaten, what the time he got up in the morning, the places that he has been to. What's kind of moving, however, is I think last year, his father passed away. So he gathered all the data he could about his father, going through all his, writings, school reports, and everything. And he created a report, a kind of a factual and data-driven report of his father's life, which I thought was very moving. So that's our stories, the way that we tell our stories. So how do we view other people's stories these days? So of course, there's this guy, presenting other people's stories in a stream, which isn't the best way, I don't think, in terms of communicating stories. I mean, they give you little snapshots of what people are doing, but it doesn't really. I mean, the stream, the news feed, isn't the best way to look at what people's stories are, right? I mean, it's just informational. You just discard it if you're not interested. Same with Twitter, right? It's not really story-driven. So, as much as this is the way that we engage people these days, this isn't the best way to engage people, in terms of having a stronger relationship with them. It's not really story-driven. We want to share our stories. Whenever people meet, what happened to me today? This happened to me today. And people automatically start sharing stories, and that's how we, communicate and have a relationship with other people. However, if you take the same information and put it into this application, which is called Flipboard, I mean, it becomes an amazing story. It's, I mean, just the format. It takes Twitter feeds, Facebook feeds, and just by very simple things, bolding certain text, making them bigger, presenting them with images, makes it look like a magazine. And you automatically, just like when you looked at the animation and started, imagining stories, you start to read a narrative through these things, and you start to get really engaged. Instead of just going through a news feed, you're actually being engaged by the rhythm of the information that's being presented to you, which is, vastly it's a vastly different experience and a lot more engaging. This is I'm sure some services in the States are doing this also, but this is a mapping service in Korea. And this is the actual building that I used to work in. I used to work on the 5th floor in this corner, which you can't see. But basically, it's like a map, and it's a street view of a map, right? What's interesting is that is this, actually, right there. It says 2011 August. This is when the photograph was taken. And when they started offering this service, the first thing that I did was, actually, I went to the street view of where I grew up in the 70s. And, of course, the building, the house that I grew up isn't there anymore. It's been replaced by this really ugly office building. But still, the fact that I can go back and kind of look at how it's changed I thought was incredible. What they've started to do is actually exactly what I really wanted to do was, go back in time and see what my neighborhood used to look like and how it maps to what I remember about my neighborhood. So if you take a look, they've started to provide a history of all the photographs. So they go back to 2008, August, right? So let's take a look at what it looks like back then. So the building was under construction, right? Which is really amazing. So you can actually have a history. So this is other people's stories, right? This is our story, but other people's stories. This is an objective gathering of stories that you can actually input into a history that is being gathered, by in this case, Daum Communication, which is a internet service provider in Korea. So you actually have the data, you actually have the images, you actually have the history where you can start to weave your story, our stories, into, which I thought was really interesting. And now, of course, you can track other people as well. So you can share stories literally at the same time, in real time, with the people, with a small group of people around you. I mean, Apple isn't the first, service to offer this kind of, availability. But I mean, the fact that it's just default on an iPhone that's just rolling out is a big indication as to the fact that we've come that far in terms of sharing our privacy publicly with people that we want to share it with. Foursquare, for example. I mean, if you did that 10 years ago, people will be outraged by all the privacy concerns, but now people willingly share that information. And that just shows how far our kind of attitudes around sharing information, around, sharing our stories through mobile media has really come. So this is a treasure hunt. I mean, people go on certain treasure hunts with location-based information. So there's also geocaching, where you hide certain things in very remote locations, and you just provide them some clues as to how to find it. And people actually go on these adventures to locate these little hidden gems and hide things themselves as well. And there's a whole kind of gaming industry around that. So I mean, it's a story, it's sharing. So there's a community, there's a story, and there's an objective, and that's enabled through mobile technologies. I thought this was pretty interesting. The latest Picasso exhibition in New York actually created this poster, which maps one of his iconic figures on a Manhattan map. I'm not absolutely sure if you actually went to these locations. I think there might have been a QR code at each of these locations that gives you something, but I'm not absolutely sure. But I thought mapping something virtual onto a physical environment, I thought was a very interesting use of marketing. since I'm always interested in how the physical and the virtual kind of interact with each other. So the highest level that we can have in this environment, I think, which is unique, which is something that hasn't really happened in the history of kind of communications or the history of human society, really is to have a collective story gathering automatically, right? The internet really allows our collective stories to be gathered in a way that simply was not possible before. You would have your community stories, you would have your individual stories, you would have your photo albums, but now you have a body of data that's being collected every day, every hour, every minute, every second, that really tells a larger, more collective story. This is a really interesting project that was started originally. It's called Ushahidi, which was originally started in Kenya to track presidential election irregularities. This was started by a reporter who had a blog, and she was getting so many tips on her blog that she enlisted 2 developers to create a mapping application that automatically took the data and located it on a map, right? And that has built out into an open source mapping tool, which was used during the Haiti earthquake to gather data. So all these points are actual people with their cell phones reporting on these issues, right? Public health, infrastructure damage, fire, menaces, security threats. So they were actually texting, to Ushahidi, this repository, and almost in real time gathering data as to where some of the biggest issues were located. And this really helped the relief agencies to really concentrate on certain areas and address security issues, address public health issues, and other things. So this is a graph of how the density of of the frequency of the texting that was happening. So obviously, right after the earthquake, there was a huge amount of activity, and then it kind of settled down. But still, I mean, this is a collective story. Each of these data points is a story that somebody is gathering through their mobile device, and when it's gathered together, you can actually see a collective story, and you can animate this to see how the information was pouring in and how it was being treated. And Steve Jobs, as to say the obvious, he died a couple of weeks ago. But when you ask people, how did you hear about Steve Jobs' death? I mean, how did you hear about it?
Our test manager came down the hall and said, Steve Jobs died.
How did he find out about it?
It's a good question. I'm not sure.
Right. How did you hear about it?
Email here as well, and I don't know how they find out.
Right. So, I mean, in my office, people found out a bit first through Twitter. It was like passing through Twitter, and Twitter, people who heard through Twitter started to go down the hall and tell other people, started emailing, picking up the phone, and doing other things. But first, I think the most rapid first wave of information passed through Twitter, I think.
Just you're in a mobile environment, whereas we're in an email-centric environment.
Right, exactly. Right. But, the funny thing is, there was a collective gasp, through the US and other parts of the world, when they heard the story. Nobody was kind of expecting it to be so soon. I think Samsung folks weren't expecting it so soon. A major competitor and a corporation that has very antagonistic relationships with Apple, obviously. So there was this collective gasp, and people started to tell that story through any means possible. The interesting thing is, in terms of tweets per second, it didn't even hit number 1. It was number 5. Steve Jobs' death is, 6,049 tweets per second, which is at the peak. Number 1 is Beyonce's MTV Video Music Awards. 8,868 tweets per second, which is kind of interesting.
She announced she was pregnant.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, everybody was tweeting that away like crazy, right? So, this tells a collective story that you just couldn't tell before. The tweets per second is an indication of what kind of stories are really making the headlines. The traditional media didn't pick up on these stories until a couple of hours later, right? So this collective gasp, this collective moment is really captured very well through the number of tweets that are going through Twitter's system, right? And that tells a collective story that simply wasn't available previously. So,
I think it's interesting that Japan beats the US as the second.
yeah, this is kind of interesting, isn't it? Yeah. How random can you get?
Somebody cares about the Women's World Cup.
Yes.
Right, I think these are the Japanese, people like tweeting, crazed tweeting, because Twitter is pretty big in Japan as well, right? You would expect certain things to be pretty high on the list, but Brazilians are, tweet a lot, and Latin America tweets a lot as well. So Brazil eliminated, that's huge news, right? So, if Moses had, smartphones, what would have happened? Probably he wouldn't have wandered through the desert like this, for 40 years, right? He would have had GPS, and he would have said, okay, and God's word probably came through, an app, on his smartphone. It says, oh, actually, God wants us to wander through the desert for 40 years. Okay. How am I going to communicate that to the rest of the Israelites? But what's interesting here is that, tweet it. Yeah, exactly. How many tweets per second can that go through? But the interesting thing is, in the Bible, it's the story. It's because there's a rich story in Exodus and all the, and all the books that relate to this journey. Leviticus, although that's pretty boring, but anyway, you have other books. It's the story that has the richness, and it has the stories that we can learn from, that we can reflect on, right? And if that wasn't captured, then what would have been? We wouldn't have that rich history to reflect upon, right? So I think stories. The mobile experience has that potential to capture those stories, and we really have to look for deep opportunities to have the insights to be able to collect a collective story. Obviously, this story is a very, very collective story. It's not just about one man, Moses. It's about the Israelites and all the things that they went through the 40 years when they wandered through the desert. Right? It was a very collective story, and mobile really has that ability to have a collective impact in terms of story gathering and storytelling. This is a kind of interesting app that I recently stumbled across. So it takes my Facebook, it takes my tweets, it takes my Flickr, it takes my blogging, it takes all those things and puts it together in a diary. So I can actually take a look at certain days, and I can take a look at all the activities on certain given days. It takes Foursquare information as well. So what's interesting is, if I die and if my kids, take a look at this, they can actually reconstruct my life through all these various, data points that collected in a single collection. And actually, when you have a story like that, right now everything is kind of dispersed on Facebook, Twitter, and none of these are coming together. But if you have something like this, it really tells a very, very different story. There are periods when I have nothing, right? And I'm thinking, what did I do back then? I was depressed. I didn't do anything because I was depressed, and I just couldn't do anything, right? Or maybe it was a family tragedy, or maybe I was doing something else. But where there are peaks of activity, I realized that these were peaks of happiness, or peaks of activity where my kids were born, or when I started a new job, or so you have these peaks and dips, and they don't have that kind of mapping ability right now, or graphing ability right now. But I can see the graphs, happening in the future, and seeing the peaks and the dips within my life. But what would happen if you plotted that in different levels, right? What about our family? What about my community? What about my nation? What about the whole world? And when you start plotting these things in different scales, you have a richness of story that just wasn't available because the data points weren't being collected in a coherent way before. So, I spent 1 year working on the urban plan. I had the opportunity, a really incredible opportunity to work on the urban plan for Hanoi of 2030. And one thing that I learned through that experience was looking at different scales of the city is the way that urban planners really work. City as a whole needs a certain amount of markets, a certain number of airports, a certain number of hospitals, and a certain number of schools. If you take a look at a smaller level, it needs a certain amount of recreational facilities. And as you get smaller and smaller and smaller, all the way down to a house, there are different needs that each of those things address. And urban planning and urban design tries to address things in multiple levels. I mean, thinking about just these things on multiple scales and multiple levels is really hard. But it has to do with my life, the quality of my life. When it comes down to that, I don't want to be a product of, victim of just, overall planning around the neighborhood. I want people to care about me as an individual. So that's what I learned through, this urban planning and urban design exercise. However, if you take a look at data, right now it has the potential to do that. And people don't think of it in different levels and different scales. What does it mean for an individual person gathering information? What does it mean for the family in terms of gathering information? What does it mean for the community? What does it mean for the country? What does it mean for the world? And once you start looking at that in various different levels and being able to manipulate that in different levels, that's when real stories start to emerge, and stories that weren't able to emerge before start to really take shape. So this is what the incredible person, Jonathan Harris. He does a lot of work with data. This is a project that he worked on called the Whale Hunt. He went on a whale hunt and he basically documented, took photographs in a very analog way, took photographs at every 30-minute interval. And when he found that his heartbeat was really beating faster because of the adrenaline flowing through him, he would actually take photographs at a shorter interval, right? A whale hunt isn't a pretty sight. And this is something that he really experienced for the first time. This is one of the more kind of tame images. There are some really, really graphic images. And you can tell when those graphic images happen by the density of photographs that map directly to his heartbeat. So over here is where they caught the whale and they start taking it apart, right, cutting it up. And you can see, what he's going through just by the density of information that's flowing through this story. So that got me thinking, right? So this is a jawbone. A jawbone's up. This is a new wristband that tracks your health and tracks other metrics, biometrics, automatically, and feeds it to your smartphone. So it's not just about health information, but what happens if you start mapping that to actual photographs and other things in your life of when Jobs died or when Beyonce announced she was having a baby. Your heart skipped a beat, right? And that could be tracked by this guy. And what happens if Nielsen ratings have not just calls people up and asks what they're doing and how they're feeling about certain television programs, but have these devices on people? What really excites people? What really once you start mapping that kind of bio data with actual, informational data, I think that's when you start to have a different level of collective information gathering and collective storytelling, which might be really, really compelling. So this is what the photographs look like on a circle, Jonathan Harris. And another project that Jonathan Harris really did much earlier than that was the We Feel Fine project, where he, scans blogs and scans Twitter for the word I feel ... And these are all the things that people feel. And you can actually take a look at the words, take a look at various metrics, and start, manipulating the data to see how people feel, how women feel in their 20s when it's sunny within a certain country on a certain date, right? So that's another way of collectively looking at information, and you can actually take a look at some of the more common words. I feel better was a really good one. I feel bad, I feel good, I feel right. And you have this whole long tail of people expressing their kind of feelings. And this site really gathering that information and presenting it in a very compelling way. So, once again, if you take a look at this photograph through a plain window, you see the bigger picture, but you realize somebody's having a story right there, right? It's a big picture, and you see the roads and you see what's happening. But, this is a neighborhood. What's happening around this baseball yard? what's happening in this house? What's happening in this neighborhood? And now, with internet information and with mobile technology, you can actually go down to that level and start seeing things in a different way and a different scale. So, obviously, photosynthesis is doing that incredibly well. I mean, I can't. I'm actually very honored to be standing here and presenting because I respect so much the stuff that's happening in this building. But this is a book that I recently revisited. This is called City of Glass by Paul Auster. It's part of his New York trilogy, and the story is it's a short story about this man who gets visited by this mysterious woman who says, "I'll pay you to just follow this old guy around and see what he's doing." So he follows this guy around New York. Around the neighborhood where I actually went to school, and he starts, trying to make sense of what he's doing. He's picking up things here, he's buying stuff there, he's actually walking around the neighborhood in very random ways, and he's thinking, actually, it's not just random, maybe he's actually doing something in a very deliberate way, and he starts mapping it on a map. Maybe this looks like a hand, maybe that looks like a butterfly or an M, maybe there's some meaning in this. So as he digs deeper and deeper into this, finding a meaning of this old man's story, he starts losing his story, and in the end, he disappears, right? So, I mean, that talks about what is the meaning in the information. And once we start losing sight of the meaning within the information, that's when we start losing ourselves in a more abstract way. So we really have to, instead of just looking at the data as it is, I mean, stories actually allow us to have a hook, allows us to have a meaning, allows us to find the meaning in this flood of data that we're looking at. So this is something that somebody did on a map, and if you kind of look at the way that they're meandering, it says, "I still haven't found what I'm looking for." I thought this is kind of a good kind of indication as to where things could be going if we don't really have a story to tell through the information that we present. So that's it. That's my kind of meandering thoughts about mobile and storytelling and what is possible now we have mobile technologies and have all this data and all this computing power at our disposal. Okay, great. Thank you.